Hello, everyone. Welcome back to week 6 of our Bible Origin series, working through the Pentateuch. And last week we explored Exodus part 1 and talked about how the Israelites were going to be leaving Egypt. And we asked a question last week: will Israel's heart be just as hard as Pharaoh's? And this week we're going to answer that question. So it's kind of where we left off last week. And this week we're in Exodus part 2. And just a quick recap: Exodus means way out. And we talked a little bit about that, but it's a story of Israel leaving Egypt, is the first part. And then we're going to see them kind of camp out at Mount Sinai for the part we're talking about today, which is the second part. The first part covers chapters 1 through 18 and really explores the idea of Israel becoming free from the power of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. We talked a lot about 10 plagues, Passover, and all that represents. And this week we're going to be talking about how do they stay free? How do they make it to this land that was promised to Abraham, and how do they walk in covenant relationship with God? And that's where we're going to start going. And what's unique about this whole story is they're going to be introduced to the covenant with God. They're going to get the 10 commandments. They're going to break the covenant immediately following their agreement. And that is at the same time Moses is up on the mountain receiving blueprints for this tabernacle, this tent, this holy tent, which will become the spot where God's manifest presence comes. They are like the hosts of God's presence, and that's going to be right in the middle of the camp. But as Moses is getting these instructions on Mount Sinai, they're going to break the covenant by creating this golden calf and worshiping it. And then after that whole incident takes place, they're going to actually build the tabernacle, and it's very much a repeat to what is mentioned already in the text for the instructions for the tabernacle. We'll talk about why it's repeated that way. And then it ends in a very peculiar way because Moses goes up to the tabernacle that's been built and doesn't go in. And so it's kind of a interesting picture of what's going on in Israel's heart. And then Leviticus, what we'll get into next week, is going to start to answer how do we restore our broken relationship with God again, and how do we enter into his presence, and what needs to take place for that to happen. And that will be kind of the middle story of these 5 books. Leviticus is the third spot, and it's directly in the middle, and it ties both halves of the Pentateuch together, which we'll talk more about next week. But this week we're talking Exodus part 2, chapters 19 through 40. And we're going to start with the covenant with Israel, and that's going to start in chapter 19. Then into 20 is where we see the 10 commandments, the famous 10 commandments. And then we're going to move into the tabernacle blueprints and instructions and the furnishings and what those mean. Then we're going to see that they break the covenant and then build the tabernacle. And then, like I said, it ends with Moses not entering. So 10 commandments here are the first 5. So no other gods. So essentially no spiritual idols, nothing in your heart, nothing in your attention or your focus that comes before God. Then we have no graven image or no idols made by physical means. So first one is no idols of the heart. The second one is no idols of the hand. And then we're going to see no using God's name in vain, to blaspheme or to say his name in a way that's unworthy or uncharacteristic of him. And they took that very seriously, and Jewish people still to this day take that very serious and hold the name of God in high reverence. Then remember the Sabbath, and then we go into honor your father and mother. And then we'll see the second set of 5 here, which is don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, no false witness, and don't covet. And what's kind of unique about the 10 commandments, or kind of cool, is that the first 4 really relate to our relationship with God. So no idols made by the heart, no idols made by the hand, no using the name of God in vain, and then remembering the Sabbath as a way to remember what God did in creation, and that ultimately we're supposed to rest in Him, not in our own ability, and that He is our ultimate provider. There's a lot of meaning to the Sabbath, but the Sabbath is kind of a hinge covenant, not covenant, but commandment, where we also see that as it pertains to relating to others. So it helps us when we rest properly and worship God properly and can walk in relationship with a perfect God. We start to begin to understand how to walk in relationship with others, which is where the other 6 commandments come in, and they relate to other people. So the first 4 really relate to our relationship with God, and the last 6 relate to our relationship with others. A couple notable things about the 10 commandments. The Sabbath is the longest commandment. It has instructions on how and why to do a Sabbath, how to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And then we see honoring the father and mother is the first commandment with a promise. And Paul actually quotes that in Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 3. He says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother," a direct quote there, "which is the first commandment with a promise." And then he quotes the rest of it, "so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy a long life on the earth." So it's the first commandment with a promise, and it's an important one. So back to our outline. Again, that's the covenant. Now we're going to move into the tabernacle blueprints or the instructions. So Moses gets all these instructions for building this tabernacle, this tent, this mobile sanctuary, mobile temple. This is a time in Israel's history where they don't have a temple yet, but the temple is going to be a more permanent located tabernacle, essentially. But the tabernacle is this traveling tent, the tent of meeting, which there is a little confusion on that. The tent of meeting and the tabernacle essentially function as the same thing. Moses would have had a tent of meeting that's referenced prior to the tabernacle being built. And so they are 2 structures, but also the terms are used interchangeably. So the tent of meeting and the tabernacle become essentially the same place. So, but there is kind of 2 different structures, at least early on. But the tabernacle here, as you can see in this little picture, is a kind of 3. It's a rectangle, but 3 concentric spaces that lead from a holy spot to a more holy spot to the most holy spot. And God has them build this tabernacle in the middle of the camp of Israel. And I'll show a picture about that in a little bit. But what's really unique is, and I got this from Tim Mackey of the Bible Project, but he talks about the literary design of this portion of Exodus. And it actually starts with 7 speeches. And in the 7 speeches, they mention the 7 furnishings. So there's 7 different furnishings for this tabernacle. And one of the furnishings is a lampstand with 7 lamp stands to hold 7 lamps, which we'll talk about what that symbolizes in a little bit. And then the priestly garments are made of 7 pieces, 7 different things that symbolize different things. And then we see that there is a 7-day ordination for the priests. And then we get 7 more paragraphs. And there's a couple other little tidbits in there, but 7 more paragraphs. And then it ends with remembering the 7th day. And so there's all these literary 7s, and the number 7 in the Hebrew language represents the number of God, the number of completeness or fullness. So just some kind of interesting things, not like an earth-shattering discovery, but just literary in the Hebrew. It's broken down with all these pictures of completeness. God wants to bring a restored relationship to the people, and this is the avenue in which he's going to make his presence known to them, and they will host the presence of God, who is a heavenly being on this earthly tabernacle. So it's actually a picture of Eden again, and it's like this little mini microcosm of Eden, that God is trying to restore this idea of walking in fellowship with him and walking in right relationship with him. So God puts the tabernacle, he tells him, put it in the center of the camp. And I think it's so that way he can be, center of their focus, and that he's equally accessible to all the people, right? And so this is God beginning to reveal more of his character to his people, the Israelites, and saying, hey, I want to be in the center of your life. I want you to be near me, and I want to be accessible to everyone. And I think that is a theme we see throughout the Bible. And even to this day, God wants to walk in relationship with his people. And who are his people? Ultimately, all of us are his people. But in this portion of scripture, we see the Israelites are that picture of God's chosen people. So, getting into the blueprints here, we see Exodus 25, verses 8 through 9. It says this: Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. So God's giving Moses these instructions, and he's supposed to have these craftsmen make these different furnishings. And we'll walk through all of these furnishings here in just a second. But they all have significance and all point to either aspects of God's character or to the coming Messiah who will come and ultimately fulfill all of these sacrificial rituals of the covenant. So the first one we see is the brazen altar, the bronze altar. It's sort of in a square, kind of a grill almost is kind of a way to describe it. Think of like a very big fire pit, but it would have been square with four horns, one on each of the corner, and there would have been poles to carry this, and there would have been about halfway down there would have been a grate, so the priest could put coals or um, wood or whatever to burn, and then they'd put meat on top and roast that and turn that into smoke essentially, and burn the sacrifice. So this was a place for the offerings to be made. This would have been in the outer court of the tabernacle. This would have been in the outer structure, outside of the actual tent, the tabernacle itself. It would have been in the outer court kind of, and this is where they would make sacrifices. Typically, these are the daily sacrifices or the individual sin or burnt offerings. So that's the first thing. And then also in the outer court, we see this laver basin, which is this place where the priests can wash their hands. They can wash, if as they're doing these sacrifices, they're having to, cut these animals into pieces and put them on the altar and all these things. So a lot of blood, a lot of things happening. This is a spot for them to wash both ceremonially and just to be cleansed practically, I think, as well. So this is where they would cleanse, and this represents the cleansing, purity, repentance, or the washing. So that's kind of the picture there. Then we get into the table of the showbread, or the table of the presence, and on this little table that's overlaid, they would have had 12 little loaves of bread, essentially these flat loaves, and they would have refresh these or replace these on a weekly basis. But these are 12 loaves to represent the 12 tribes. And essentially, this would have been inside the first section of the tent. So this would have been past one of the first curtain. And this would have been in the holy place, is what that's called. And it represents Israel's presence before God continually, perpetually. So that's what that represents. And then we get to the lampstand. The lampstand is kind of one of the most interesting pieces because it's actually fashioned and hammered out of solid gold, and it's got 7 spots for the 7 lampstands. And that maybe sounds familiar. In Revelation, we see there's 7 lampstands as well, 7 churches. So a little bit of pre-foreshadowing there, but there's these 7 lampstands, or 7 stands of the lamp, and they hold 7 lamps with wicks and with oil. And so they would go through and actually trim the wicks and tend to the oil. and make sure that the light perpetually burns every single evening and morning. So this is a callback to the creation narrative. There's evening and there's morning, first day, evening, morning, second, all the way through the seventh day. This is again a callback to the original design of God, the original creation of God. And this is a picture even of Eden. Again, like God wants his light to shine perpetually and forever in perfect harmony with his people, right? Um, and what's cool about the lampstands, there's all these little almond blossoms on it. And there's a little bit of discussion or some possibilities to what those represent. But in Israel, the first tree that would blossom is an almond tree, and we actually see later in the book of Numbers, I think it's Numbers 17 maybe, Aaron's staff blossoms and buds out these almonds, and it was God's way of saying he's my chosen person to be priest. And so there's some significance there, but also, like I said, almonds are the first tree in Israel to bloom, and so the word for almond is very similar to the Hebrew word for watch. We actually see this in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. It says, "The word of the Lord came to me being Jeremiah. What do you see, Jeremiah? I see the branch of an almond tree," I replied. And the Lord said to me, "You have seen correctly, for I am watching," that word sounds like almond, "to see that my word is fulfilled." And so almonds are a picture of God's ever watchfulness, again calling back to light. There's always light, he's always watching. There's no darkness in him, right? But also his speed, he will hasten to accomplish his word, is what another translation says. He will be quick to act upon his word and his promise. So he's ever watchful and quick to move to action on his people's behalf, is really what that whole thing represents. So a very, very rich symbology with the lampstands, and we see that repeatedly. So kind of a cool thing. Then we see also in the holy place the altar of incense, and this represents the prayers of God's people perpetually rising before him. And David actually, in Psalm 141, verse 2 says, "May my prayer be set before you like incense. May the lifting up of my hands be like the evening sacrifice." So this idea of our prayers and our worship rising to God in heaven and being this pleasing aroma and being worshipful to him. So those kind of ideas flow hand in hand there. So, and then the last two I'm going to put together one slide here, but it's the Ark of the Covenant, which is the lower part, and then the atonement cover, or many other translations call it the mercy seat. And this represents kind of the throne of God, or even almost like the footstool of God. Like God and his presence would have been above this Ark of the Covenant and atonement cover. And we know from Isaiah's vision of the throne room, or the temple, and Ezekiel. So Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah says, "In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, seated high," and he sees these seraphim. The cherubim are actually the angels on the atonement cover. But in Ezekiel, I think it's Ezekiel 10, he sees a vision of God on his throne, and also sees cherubim. So there's these angelic beings that are attending and worshiping God Almighty, and they see that in their spiritual eyes or spiritual vision, that God is actually seated above. But when the high priest would walk in to the Holy of Holies, which is where the Ark of the Covenant and the atonement cover, the mercy seat, would have been, there's no physical sign of God necessarily, except perhaps when the cloud is seated on the tent. But the visions that we see from Isaiah and Ezekiel show that God in the heavenly realm or the spiritual realm is above that mercy seat, and that's representative of his throne. And this is literally the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place, was where heaven and earth collided, like physically God's presence came and dwelt in that holy place, the most holy place. And it's again a picture of Eden again, where God walked with man in the garden physically. And so whether God ever took physical form or not, I'm not totally sure, but the fact that his manifest presence, his full glory was dwelling in that tent, and he was, there, is a really cool thought. But the high priest would go in there once a year on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and would make atonement for his and all the people's sins. So a collective nationwide um, moment where they would atone and be made right again with God. So we'll talk more about that in Leviticus and later through the Pentateuch. So talking quickly about priestly garments, there's again 7 pieces in Exodus 28:4. It lists 6, but there's actually one other garment. But they would have had this breast piece, a linen ephod, which kind of end up tying together, the robe, the tunic, this turban, which has this gold band that says "Holy to God" on the top and right in the forehead, a sash, and then which is kind of like, to girdle, to tie everything, almost like a belt, I think, more so. And then there would have been undergarments to cover their nakedness or their shame. So do have a little picture here, and I got this from the internet, and I think it's a rose chart. But anyways, they would have had 2 onyx stones, one on each shoulder, and those represent a couple different things. Number one, they would have had 6 names of the tribes of Israel on each. So together they would have had all 12, starting from the first born, which I believe is Reuben, all the way down to Benjamin, the youngest. And they would have worn those as a remembrance to God. So as God's kind of looking down from heaven, he sees on top of the shoulders the names of the 12 tribes and remembers his covenant or his promise to Israel. And that way the priest can live, essentially. But also I think the onyx stones helped the priest remember the weight of what he's doing, and that he's carrying, especially on the Day of Atonement, he's carrying the sins of the people, all 12 tribes, in before God, and he must do things appropriately and in a holy way, and that there's certain liturgy he's going to follow. And it's the weight of carrying the people before God. He is God's representative to the people, and he's the people's representative to God. And again, that's a callback to Eden, that we're called to rule on earth in the image of God. That's what the priest, that's our priestly role as humans. And that's what the priest would have carried before him. And that's part of that symbology. So again, his turban has the little gold band that says "Holy to God." And then the breastplate and ephod kind of tied together, but the breastplate would have had 12 stones, unique stones, one for each of the different tribes, and he's going to carry them before. And then he also has in there the Urim and Thummim. And I think I'm hopefully saying that right, but it's like a black and white stone type of thing, where he would make, cast lots is maybe another way to say it, but like he would see what God is trying to speak to the people. Should we do this or do this? It's like a yes or no or a A-B type thing, and would, pull these out or whatever. So it was over the heart to represent making decisions on behalf of God, not on behalf of himself. So, and then all that ties in together with kind of an ornate robe and tunic, and then again the undergarment to cover their nakedness and not to be exposed in their sin before God. So after this, we see Israel's going to, back to our outline here, break the covenant. And how does that happen? The golden calf incident. So in Exodus 32, Israel actually breaks their covenant with God, right? They agree to the 10 Commandments. They agreed to everything Moses has said to them. We'll do it as God has told us. Moses goes up on the mountain for 40 days, and they instantly are like, hey, let's just make an idol in our hearts and with our hands. So they're breaking the first two commandments right away. Um, and a way I've heard this compared that I think is a good way of saying it, it's like cheating on your wife or your husband, whatever, on your wedding day. Like they make an agreement with God, and then instantly, just a short time later, as Moses is literally getting these instructions on how to build a tabernacle so God's presence can dwell with them, they break the covenant. And it's like, you got to be kidding me. We're not even past the honeymoon yet, and you're cheating on God here. So that's what happens. And I think what it shows us is that the enemy will try to tempt you where God is trying to take you. And last week we talked about how in Exodus, when they leave the Egyptians, and they're about to go out into the wilderness to worship, they plundered the Egyptians. They take all their gold and silver and these fine, um, cloth and linen. Well, what's all of that going to be used for? It's going to be used for building the tabernacle, for making the curtains, and for overlaying the altars, and for overlaying the table, and making the lampstand, and making the Ark of the Covenant. And what does the enemy entice them to do? Is use all that gold for making this idol. And instead of using it for building the Ark of the Covenant and all these other furnishings for God's presence to come dwell among them, they use it to break the covenant. And it's this picture of really how we work as humanity. Like, there's so many times where God is gracious to us, and then we turn around and use those things to break his heart. And so it's really a picture, not of Israel so much, but as humanity, that we break God's heart frequently. So what is God going to show us through all of this? Our big takeaway for this week is God is both merciful and just. And we will see that God is faithful to those who are faithful to him. He's faithful even when we're not faithful, but he will be just. And yes, he's merciful, but he will also hold us to a standard. So we see this in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. It says, he passed in front of Moses, he being God, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. So God says, hey, look, if you obey my covenant, I will be merciful and gracious and abounding in love and faithful, even to thousands of generations. But I will not leave sin undealt with, right? I will forgive sin and deal with rebellion, but I cannot leave the guilty unpunished. Like, there has to be a payment for sin. And that's what we're going to see in Leviticus. I know some people ask, well, isn't that kind of unfair that God would judge, children to the third or fourth generation? In Deuteronomy 24, actually, God kind of clarifies this a little bit. There's a law that says parents are not to be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their parents. Each will die for their own sin. So that's in Deuteronomy 24, verse 16. What God, I think, is really saying here is, I will be far more merciful, and I'm far more willing to hold up my end of the covenant than you are, but I must be just at the same time. And so God is going to provide a way to atone for sin and cover sin through animal sacrifice and through these rituals that we'll see in Leviticus, but it must still be dealt with. And he doesn't necessarily want to punish us or his creation, but because sin has a price, it has to be paid. And so that's what we're going to see more of in Leviticus. So stay tuned for the next coming weeks. But back to our outline, last chunk here in chapters 35 through 40 is the tabernacle actually gets built. And there's a whole narrative, and it's very, very repetitive and similar to chapters 25 through 31, where Moses is getting the instruction, build it this way. You should take boards and then overlay them with bronze, and then make sure they're 18, or not 18, but they're 2 cubits long or what. So there's all these specific measurements, right? Cubits about 18 inches. That's why I said 18 there. But there's all these specific things to do. And we see a similar thing in Genesis, right? When God gives Noah the command to build a different type of ark, right? He's building this boat that's going to float above the earth. And Moses is getting a command to build the Ark of the Covenant, right? And it's very specific and it's very outlined, and God gives him pretty significant detail to follow, right? Well, in Noah's narrative, it says, and Noah went and built the ark just as the Lord commanded. Why don't the authors or the scribes or the editors of this text, why not just cut out a few chapters of this? Because scrolls are not just lying around, not easy to come by. It's expensive to copy scrolls, especially throughout history. It takes a lot of work, meticulous work, to transcribe these and recopy them by hand. Why mention all the same details more or less over again? Well, I think there's reasons for this. Why repetition? There's something really, really important that the author or the scribes throughout history wanted us to see. And so we have to stop and ask, why the repetition? So I think there's 2 reasons. Number one, repetition stresses importance. For whatever reason, to the original audience and original receivers of this text, it was very important that they take note of certain things. And the instructions of the tabernacle were important enough for them to say, we need to make sure we write down the instructions, but also that Moses followed them to the T. So we know that that is what needs to be done. But in instances where there is repetition and it's very similar, whatever is different, we need to pay attention to, because there's something there in the contrast that is telling us, hey, pay attention to why this happens. And one of the contrasting or differential details in the second part is how Moses interacts with God's presence. So in Exodus 24, again, these are during the initial instructions of how to build the tabernacle. We see Moses goes up on the mountain and the cloud covers it. And the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. And Moses enters the cloud on the mountain, and there he stays for 40 days and 40 nights. So Moses, again, they've made this covenant with God, and he's able to go up on the mountain and be in the cloud of God's presence, representing his physical manifest presence on earth, right? Where heaven invades earth. Now, we're going to see a very similar picture and even very similar wording in Exodus 40, which is where the book ends. And Moses is going to try to, again, go into relationship or go into communion with God, right? And the cloud is going to cover, this time not the mountain, but the tent of meeting or the tabernacle. It says that the cloud covers it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, which is interesting. Before, he could go into the cloud. So why can't he go in the cloud now? Well, it's because Israel broke the covenant with God, and Moses has to intercede for them. And this is, again, where he becomes a type of Christ, because where is Christ right now? He's at the right hand of the Father interceding for God's people, the believers, right? So we see that Moses becomes a type of Christ in that. But now that Israel's broken this covenant, Moses can't enter because the cloud settled and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So the book ends where Moses is like, wanting to go back and speak with God, but he can't. And what is changed? Was it God? No, it was Israel, right? They broke the covenant. And again, this is a picture of the fall of man. Again, we see that in Genesis chapter 3. In the Noah account, we see it repeatedly throughout all of these generations, that no matter how much we try, we're still just as broken as Adam. And I think sometimes we would love to give Adam and Eve a hard time for being the people that screwed it up. But if we were in their spot, we would do the same thing. So no, God doesn't change. He doesn't change like we do. He doesn't just make up his mind and then change it 2 seconds later, even though there's instances where it might seem like that. He's not actually doing that. But what happens is sin separates us from God's holy presence. And what we're going to see in Leviticus is God is going to give the people through the priesthood rituals and ways to make atonement. That's going to be our big word next week. Atonement for their sin, so that way sin no longer separates them from God's holy presence. And that's what we're going to see next week on the Bible Origins. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. Hopefully you were able to glean some things. There's some good videos also on YouTube that show the tabernacle in kind of a 3D rendering, or how it would have been outlined, or some good pictures. So it's definitely worth searching up and looking at some of those, because when you can see the physical space, it's a little bit easier to see how and why they had to do certain things and rituals to get into that. And so we'll talk more about the rituals and the practices and the sacrifices next week. So stay tuned for that. But a couple discussion questions if you want to take some time and reflect on these or do some further research on your own. And a great question to meditate on this week in our lives, just like David prayed to the Lord, search me and know me, and really expose these idols in my heart. This is a great question. Are there any idols or sin in your life keeping you from God's presence being active in your life? And that's something to meditate on and take to prayer. And so, once again, thanks for joining us on the Bible Origins. We'll be back next week in Leviticus. So, thanks for watching.